Good morning, my name is Lorraine Jacobs, and welcome to Sunday Morning Forum at the First Unitarian Society in Milwaukee. There's a few notes first, and one is about masks. If you were here, I mentioned you can wear a mask, it's optional, and we ask that you'll accommodate anyone's request for additional coverage. So that's where we're at with masks. We're waiting a little bit. We were waiting a little bit for the service to end. There still is some going on downstairs in the service, and I think some people will be coming up for that too. So we'll see. There'll be a basket circulated. The funds received support forums at First Unitarian. Next Sunday, January 15th, we will begin once again having coffee and hot water for tea in the hallway at Mass Auto Hall here. So some of you who aren't regular attendees know that that's been wished for a long time. So you don't have to stop first. You come right upstairs. We'll have the coffee and tea for you here. Our forum next Sunday, we will welcome Heather Dubois Buznan, who will describe the support offered through the Wisconsin Public Education Network. So that will be next Sunday at the same time here in Max Auto Hall. We have regular Sunday morning forums. One other notion is I wanted to make sure we have a regular tech person, that's Mark, and you may be missing him today. He'll be away for the next few months off and on for his vacation. He loves the cold and snow of our national parks. He's out and about. So he has trained Trent and Bruce, and we're trying our best to make it all work. And sometimes technology has a mind of its own, and we'll go with that too. We're getting help from Jim Spice, who is there at church. And finally, today, we welcome Dennis Conta, and I'll introduce him. Dennis Conta has a deep and sincere commitment to quality of life in Wisconsin and Milwaukee. He has served in the state assembly until 1976, when he became secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Revenue. In 1979, he formed a consulting firm focused on governmental concerns. Today, Mr. Conta has a long list of observations to share about democracy, and there'll be time for him to express his concerns and information, and then there'll be time for some questions and conversation too. So please welcome Dennis Conta.
I want to thank Lorraine and Jim Mueller, who is doing the work behind the slides today. Also, Jim Spice. This is not an easy and normal setting to give a speech. We are on YouTube, and when you're on YouTube, the camera reigns today. Your own presence is almost insignificant, and by that I mean you have to be positioned in a way that the camera sees the audience at home, the camera sees the screen. I need to see the screen and the microphone and the audience and the clicker. So I mentioned this to you that on occasion, if things go wrong, because all of this coordination doesn't take place perfectly, you'll have to be patient. Incidentally, I need to say something about Jim Mueller, who is conducting the slides today. Jim is a chapter 220 student, if you can imagine. Chapter 220 was a program some of you may be familiar with, and Kent was one of the people who was one of the graduates of that program. And I'm delighted, I'm actually privileged to have a 220 student running my program today rather than running his program. Thank you, Greg. Yeah, for a pleasure. So I begin with this observation. We are a deeply divided and polarized country, split apart by demographics, political ideology, gerrymandered states, party polarization, a conservative U.S. Supreme Court, diminishing voting rights, and 69% of both Democrats and Republicans feel that democracy is in a danger of collapsing. I don't understand why we feel democracy is under threat. The fact that you didn't get that irony really troubles me a bit. Maybe this is a more serious problem than I had anticipated. So with that in mind, I better get on to the serious business. I'm going to speak today about polarization of both political systems and society within three evolving themes. I'm going to try to talk about the impact that polarization has on the capacity of both states and Congress to govern, and what the nature and character of that polarization is and how it's developed. And then finally, how within the impediments and obstacles created by polarization, a liberal agenda can be advanced. And I'm going to be doing that as I trace these events over a 50-year period, beginning in 1968 when I was elected to the legislature, until this very moment. And after the term elections were completed. So with that kind of outline in mind, let me begin by making certain, we hope, Trent, that this works. By outlining how I intend to address these subjects today. I'm going to do so through a series of various concepts and issues that are on the screen here, including focusing on the 10 attributes of that have been contributing factors in creating this polarization that we are experiencing today. So let me begin with the red wave. There is no doubt that the pollsters, the pundits, the polls, people like me, maybe people like you, got it very wrong. Not only did they get it wrong, but look at what the New York Times predicted as a tragedy. If you can imagine, the debate over abortion rights has not emerged as a political silver bullet for the Democrats. How much in error could that statement have been? And yet we were all wrong. And I think we were wrong, frankly, for some pretty good reasons, as you can see on the screen. The top one, perhaps one of the most significant, sitting presidents have lost the House 38 out of the last 40 midterm elections, and Biden's approval rating was 40%, even less. So why then did we recover, and how did we recover? Those of us who have a liberal perspective. It was what I call the resistance. As you can see from this slide here, as well as the next slide, it was expected that the Republicans would win 35 to 40 seats, and they won 9. Democrats kept control of the Senate. It was the strongest outcome for a sitting president in the midterm for 40 years. And 100 million votes were counted without interruption. The women in 10 Midwestern states increased their vote by 35% over 2018. There was a massive turnout. And what was most interesting is that, and we'll talk about this in a moment, 18 to 29-year-old voters were 12 to 13% of the total vote, and 79% of this voting bloc voted for Democrats. We'll say a little bit more about that age group in the future, but it's very, very significant. So there's another set of resistance efforts here that ought to be addressed. And I want to say something about this powerful resistance that's on both of these screens. Was driven by the threat to democracy that was treated seriously, by the fact that our voting systems were demonized by President Trump and those who favor his policies. And it happened because of three women who were in this audience today. Kathy Rivera, who is active here in the Unitarian Church and organized her resistance around a good number of organizations connected with the church. Diane Baca, who worked for a committee from the state of Wisconsin, located here in Milwaukee, that identified voters and turned them out. And Pat McFarland, you know, Pat McFarland is here today, but Pat has spent years turning out the vote on behalf of liberal causes and values. Those three women epitomize the kind of turnout and the advocacy that was done over and over and over again throughout the country. And that's why that midterm election as well. Let me now talk a little bit about this chart. This chart was a prediction about the turnout that would take place during the midterm election. And it was about right. The right side of that chart, you can't quite see it, but the midterm was won by the Democrats for those two middle categories, 18 to 19-year-old voter, and 18 to 29, voter 52 to 40 or so, I think, 30 to 44, the millennium category, once again produced at a very high level. But what doesn't this vote show? Who are the voters that are not on here? I'm just curious if you're likely to come up with that important category that we're going to talk about later. Well, the voters that are not here are independents. Independent voters, as you will see from some of the data I gather, won this election for Democrats in the midterm. So there were fears, because of the advocacy of Kathy Rivera and Diane Baca and others, were averted. And the kinds of things you see on the screen took place. Trump was weakened rather than strengthened. Voters overcame 100 years of midterm history by winning this election by the amount it won by. And there was a huge, huge support for women's reproductive rights and voting rights. And as you can see on the screen again, over 100 million votes were counted without interruptions. All the same, I think there are concerns that clearly and fears that overshadow the country. As you look at these three polls, you'll see the fact that this country is very, very troubled. Both Democrats and Republicans and liberals and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. That second category, 50% of Trump voters want red states to resign, and 41% of Democrats feel the same way. Only 18% of voters trust the government all or some of the time. That's in comparison to 62% in 1968. So it may very well be that we had some brief relief during the midterm elections. But these concerns, these beliefs continue to be operative today in the country, and that's one reason why we remain so badly polarized. Let's see what I've done here. Well, so I'm going to talk about this dysfunction and this polarization within these various categories that I have here on the screen. And let me begin with the issue of demographics. The underpinning of the difference between the way Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals feel has an underpinning in demographics. I once gave a slide that Bill Holleran saw, who identified each one of these characters of race, gender, and demographics of race, gender, education, age, religion, and geography as the best way to understand the difference between liberals and conservatives and red states and blue states. I offer you this one illustration of how I did that divide. I talked about demographics in terms of the racial divide in the country. And as you can see, there's a significant difference between Republicans and Democrats in terms of race and who they voted for and who they voted against. So once again, I took that same category of race, gender, education, age, religion, and geography, kind of use it as a foundation in this previous lecture I gave to talk about polarization. So I'm going to talk about three political ideologies that also contribute to our dysfunction. Starting with traditional politics. I was greeted in 1968 when I arrived in Madison. By truly a traditional time. There were no computers, there were no internet, and there were no women. At least there was only one woman. Of the 133 legislators in Madison in 1968, 132 were men and one was a woman. There was another difference at the time. Compromise and bipartisanship was a common mode of government. I happen to serve as the co-chairman on the finance committee, and for two of the three sessions, my co-chair was a Republican. We worked well together. At the end, when the budget could be reconciled, we didn't take 2, 3 weeks or even months. And the conference committee, we met overnight and settled differences. Because again, compromise and bipartisanship is far more common than it is today. And I might say that people who were involved in this period of traditional politics are here today. Walt Kelly, then was serving as the head of Governor Lucy's Council on Criminal Justice. Walt also incidentally ran for the state Supreme Court and by a small amount lost. Part of Wisconsin would have been very different during those days if Walt had won that race. Lou Fortas, who's just in front of me, who's the publisher and editor of the Shepherd Express, during the late 70s and 80s, was involved in a range of committee assignments, ranging from business to human resources to environment. Fred Kessler, who was simply the voice of unconditional liberalism and unconditional liberal policies. When you needed Fred, even though everyone else was gone, Fred was there. And David Reamer is here as well. David Reamer, also called the Renaissance Man, was head of several agencies, advanced several policies, is the author of the Badger Care program here in Wisconsin. So it was people like Walt and Fred and Lou, the other legislator here today, who grew up during this period with these traditional policies in mind. the kind of contention we're going to talk about in a moment was largely absent, with one exception. You see this word on the bottom, AFDC. AFDC refers, as most of you may know, to aid to families with descendant children. That was a contentious issue. I need to tell you this very brief story. The first week I was in the legislature, the doors to the assembly suddenly opened, and rushing inside the assembly was Father Gruppy with 100 welfare women and men stormed into the chamber. We wisely left the chamber. The speaker at that time wisely gave it up to Father Gruppy, and for a week or so, Father Gruppy was Speaker of the Assembly, and all of our seats were taken over by welfare recipients and advocates of welfare reform. So having never been there before, I said to a colleague of mine, I had no idea you legislated this way in Madison. With any event, it went on, read it on for a couple of weeks, over really quite some time. So it was a very different time in that respect as well, but that was one of the few contentious issues that took place. Let me talk about now, I'm going the opposite way, excuse me. Identity politics. Beginning in the late 70s, going into the 80s and into the 90s. The traditional politics that I just outlined a moment ago began to receive a different kind of politics in which people could identify themselves as Republicans or Democrats, liberals or conservatives, by focusing on specific kinds of issues. And these identities, the way legislators and voters identified themselves, could be categorized inside of parties. For instance, this is a typical set of identity politics that were used by Democrats. If I go to the next slide, you'll see that these identity politics were used by Republicans. These issues, unlike the traditional politics, began to considerably expand the differences in a number of areas by people with different ideologies and party affiliation. Going back to traditional politics, if I can kind of summarize that traditional period, most of what we did was defined by fiscal conservatism and spending, liberal spending and taxes and spending, spending and programs, school aid, distribution of revenues, very, very different from these kinds of identity politics that became part of the difference that was established between parties and began to create that diversion and that polarization that exists today. So I want to talk about another kind of political identity. This is the independence that I was talking about earlier. If you look at these four polls here, you will see that independence, not only in the midterm, but in general, was having a big impact upon who wins and who doesn't win elections in this country any longer. You see that top category, I'm not certain how much we realize that it's 31% of Americans who identify today as independent. 25% as Republicans and 41%. Excuse me, I got this back, but I know. A little hard to read from my angle of vision here. 31% identify as Democrats, 25% as Republican, and 41% or a majority are identified by independents. So when we think, going back to the midterm elections, one reason we won that election, in fact, it may be the principal reason, is because Republicans and Democrats in the midterm each won 95% of their vote. But it was the remaining 5% that independents won by 14% in favor of Democrats. So it wasn't simply turnout that won this for Biden and the Democrats in the midterm, it was the independents. And what other group did we depend on so heavily? That voting group from the age of 18 to 29. So when we begin to, and I end with this, when we begin to talk about liberal strategies and advocacy tactics, these two groups, independents, voters between the ages of 18 and 29, are going to be crucial in terms of how we shape programs, and I'll get to that in just a moment. And then there is a third category of politics, joining the traditional politics and the identity politics, which surely in 1968 was never on the radar screen, I can tell you that. These are called grievance politics, also resentment politics. These are the kinds of politics that tend to be on the fringe of American politics. They have challenged and replaced many of the core principles and the values that are part of democracy as we know it. These grievance politics, along with identity politics, and obviously because traditional politics are always with us, these three categories of political ideology, when combined, produce a whole range of opportunities for legislators and men and women in Congress and voters to identify themselves and behave accordingly. So let me move to the next slide here and talk about moderates in Congress. I think this is a rather striking slide. 71 to 72, there are 160 men and women in Congress who identified themselves as moderates. Just last year, it's down to 30. So what difference does that make? Well, it makes a lot of difference in terms of how voting patterns are taking place. This shows in a very interesting and dramatic way how things have shifted in a matter of just 3 or 4 years. In 2018, as you can see, about 25% of men and women in Congress were voting straight party line, another 50% were voting near party, but there was 25% of people engaged in compromise and in bipartisan activity. In a short period of time, if you just move to the right to 2022, that 25% of bipartisanship that took place only a short time ago, in the last session, you can hardly get it on the chart. But I think it's probably what, 3-4% of bipartisanship. So that gives you some idea of how the loss of moderates on the one hand, and a lot of other activity that we've talked about and are want to talk about took place. So one of the things that contributes to this lack of bipartisanship is the filibuster. I think this is so dramatic because if you look on the left-hand side, between 1970 and 2000, the filibuster was only used 7 times. In 07-08, it went up to 100 times. And in the last session, 298 times was used by both parties, Democrats and Republicans, to filibuster legislation. If you know, filibuster is a process in which 2/3 of the Senate, or a total of 60 votes, are necessary in order to bring up a piece of legislation. It takes only one person to object, and that filibuster is in place. Again, it's not only Democrats, it's not only Republicans, but Republicans clearly, and Democrats, as you can see from the slide on the right. So all of this is taking place because of gerrymandering. Newt Gingrich in 2009, when he was Speaker of the House, put together for the first time the combination of new technology, millions of dollars in funding, in order to design very sophisticated redistricting maps. And for the first time in 40 years, that redistricting initiative took over the House for the Republicans. Incidentally, I need to tell you about how we redistricted in 1968. Different concept. Fred Kessler then was in charge of this new concept of redistricting. Came into my office. He didn't have algorithms or new technology or millions of dollars in funding. He had a yellow legal pad and a pencil. So Fred uses his yellow legal pad and his pencil. He marks out my district here and said, you know, Dennis, I think if you kind of move across this river, I've got a chance that maybe you pick up a few boats here, here and there. That was 1968. Today there are, as I indicated, millions of dollars spent principally with law firms designing the most sophisticated redistricting process. And we in Wisconsin, as you can see from the data here, arguably have the most gerrymandered state in the entire country. So gerrymandering obviously is something we need to be concerned about. And that last point, I think I'm right about this. You know, I asked Walt, the US Supreme Court has jurisdiction over racial redistricting, but not over partisan, at least for the moment. They have indicated that the issue of partisan redistricting will be left to the states. We'll get to that in a moment in terms of how that and that may also change. So what's the result of this gerrymandering? You know, trifecta means that a party has control of both chambers in the legislature, House and Senate, and also the governorship. So there are 23 states, almost 50% of all the states that are completely controlled by Republicans in the red. That means they have control of the House, they have control of the Assembly, they have control of the governorship. Another, what's the number? 14 Democrats have trifectas, and then we have 13 is it? 13 is a divided government. So Wisconsin obviously is a trifecta. And these trifectas, excuse me,
You have the governor.
oh, excuse me, I meant to say, that's right. We are one of the dividers. One of the dividers. I sense that outcry from the audience means you're paying attention.
Then you're doing a good job.
All right. Now I'm going to go to another slide, which I'm not going to show you because since you're so knowledgeable in this audience, I want you to give me the answer. This other slide shows the number of states that have control of both chambers. They have control of the House and they have control of the Assembly. How many of the 50 states have complete chamber control? Any guesses?
Yeah, you can just subtract your 13 from your 50 and
Well, I think you're
well,
going
you'll
to
have more than that. You'll have more than that. You're gonna be at
I think
45?
45.
45.
Two. There are only 2 states in the entire country. Now, based on the last election, you know, there may have been some shuffle because I'm not quite certain if this is perfectly accurate, but as you can see, only Minnesota and Virginia are the only states that don't control both chambers. The other 48 states controlled either by Republicans or by Democrats, and there's the map. That is the result on gerrymandering. That creates very strong, hardened positions. And let me ask you another question. Given these gerrymandered states, what is the most thing that candidates from a blue or a red state fear if they're running for re-election? Primaries, exactly. When you run from a red state or a blue state and you're in a primary, you had the voters, the hardest of voters, red and black, political and conservatives. And in order to lose your seat, you're likely to confront someone who's even going to be more blue than you are, or more red than you are. So to counteract that, what do? You have to become even more identified with the ideologies and the programs and the issues inside of those states. So primary is a problem for a candidate. Let me just see what I have here. Well, I think this is interesting. The color of purple, I think, or the color of politics, red and blue states. I want to kind of bring to some of you who have a little bit of a history where this term red and blue initially surfaced. It turns out that in 1976, when John Chancellor, remember John Chancellor, 1976, he was on an election night anchor and he was talking about votes for Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So what he creates at that very moment in history, he decides to put the word red, a little red, on a map for those people who are voting for Gerald Ford. And he puts the word blue on the map for those in favor of Jimmy Carter. Little did he know that he was creating at the time red and blue states. And of course, these are red and blue states. And they are defined again by these categories of demographics and political issues and all the way down the line, the kinds of things that we have been talking about. I want to talk a little bit about the media now and offer you this statistic that only 34% of the public trust mass media to report accurately and fairly. Or the mass media fails to satisfy their own sense of the truth and bias. So where is it then, especially since 1968, if you can't depend on the mass media, where do you return to? Well, that is where you return. That's the nature of mass media and the options that are today available to people. This particular chart organizes in the dark blue, if you prefer the left, the light blue if you lean left, the purple I can't see from my angle of vision is in your center, and the two reds are on the right side. So if you don't trust mass media, you've got a lot of options you can turn to within this huge category of social platforms and other media outlets. And I'm not altogether familiar with many of the terms, but I think you know how these things can be categorized. No doubt they contribute to the kind of polarization we are talking about. So let me talk a little bit now about the conservative Supreme Court. You can clearly see that the New York Times surely has a bias about the court, feeling that it's not only moving in a conservative direction, but in another poll that I saw, moving in a partisan Republican direction in terms of its rulings. While that's happening, it appears that after Roe versus Wade, or even before Roe versus Wade, I see only 25% of the public had a high degree of confidence. Now, of course, that 25% includes conservatives who don't think they're being conservative enough, and liberals who don't think they're being liberal enough. So the 25% of unhappiness, is a little misleading, but it's clear that the court that once enjoyed a very high level of public confidence is now enjoying very little. Moore versus Harper, some of you have been following this. This is also called the legislative, yeah. This is a case brought by North Carolina, which is making the argument that state legislatures should have supreme control over all elections, and neither state courts or even governors or other election institutions within a state can do anything to overrule the legislature. If carried to its extreme under the North Carolina argument, legislators would even have the right to select their own electors in the presidential race, meaning that Wisconsin wins with 20,000 votes, but the legislature decides in Wisconsin under this theory to set aside those 20,000 votes, set aside the Democrats that would be elected under those 20,000 votes, and they put in their own Republican electors. That's the scope of the Moore versus Harper case. It's my understanding, I'm turning my notes here, that oral arguments suggest that there is not a majority opinion at the moment on the court to accept the extreme version which the North Carolina plaintiffs are advancing. All the same, even the common ground that Roberts, my sense, is seeking would give the state legislature to the right to determine whether a state court was following the dictates of a state constitution, and if they were not, then the plaintiff could go to the U.S. Supreme Court in order to determine that the state Supreme Court was not following the dictates of the state constitution. So even the common ground, I think, under the resolution of Moore versus Harper is going to create some difficulties for voting rights and for one person, one vote. I think it's going to be settled, I think, sometime in June or so, at least that seems to be the prognosis. So this will surely create, depending on how the justices rule, even more division inside of our society.
I get to be Cruella de Vil right now.
Yeah.
And people are starting to go to the service, which is fine, but there'll be people who want to ask you questions.
Okay.
And you've got 10 or 15 minutes,
Okay.
and I'll help you
Sure.
see who raised their hand, but
I have a final slide
You go.
that I'm going to give you.
Okay.
So let me just go to this slide. There are a lot of repercussions of this, and that has to do with the state rights and the kinds of things that are going to be addressed. This is the only thing that I think is indispensable, which is the kind of despair that's running through the country with all these polls and how people feel about democracy. And this, however, it seems to me ought to be the essence of despair. It's what Nancy Pelosi did in order to maintain hope and persistence. It is what Kathy Rivera did, and what Diane Baca did, and what tens of thousands of people around the country did in order to set aside despair and be inspired by, if the gate is closed, we will go over the fence. And if the fence is too high, we will vault over it. And if that doesn't work, we're going to parachute in. That's the hope. That's the inspiration. Thank you.
So much.
Please.
No, don't go way too far. Let's see if there's anybody who has a question or just needs a little follow-up or something.
You don't mention class. Do you use education as a surrogate measure for class when you go through the various divisions? Because I think class is probably the most powerful force.
Yes.
Just so everyone can hear, I'll just say that the question dealt with class and inclusion of class in the whole picture.
Mhm.
Sometimes.
Question.
Did you want to respond to that question about?
No, I think you did it.
Oh, okay. Okay. People can't hear,
Please.
people can't hear the question.
The, is it called independent state legislative theory? Is that the title of the Carolina lawsuit?
Independent state legislative theory is,
Right.
I'm not certain the theory itself is built into the Constitution, but it is the theory that's being used to advance it.
And it's still a fringe theory, basically, isn't it?
Well, I'm satisfied frankly by the discussion that took place. At least I think a majority of the members of the court see its full implication as a fringe idea. It seems that way from the questions and the responses. Yes, please.
What can we do about gerrymandering?
About what?
Gerrymandering.
Yeah. Not a thing. There is little that I'm aware of that can be done. Other than a situation, and this can take place anytime during the 10-year period of a census between, say, 2022 and it'll be 21-22. A plaintiff would have a right to go to a state Supreme Court at any time during this 10-year period and raise questions about whether the legislature is violating the state constitution. That in turn could be litigated at a federal level at any time. So that could happen anytime in any state. The question is whether once it reaches a federal court, whether the US Supreme Court is going to interfere in the decision. That may depend on how Moore versus Harper, to get to your point, is finally resolved and what kind of authority is given or taken away from the state Supreme Court. Is there any other way, Walt? I don't know if other people who follow this in terms of how gerrymandering could be modified, Kathy?
Well, I think that one way to think about it is to think about the Supreme Court race in Wisconsin
Yeah.
here.
Yes.
Yes.
And to make sure that you are all informed as voters and vote for the candidate who you think will advance
Yeah.
the interests that you agree with. Because we're going to have a very important court.
Kathy, it's an excellent point, and I overlooked it. That clearly is a way to modify the red or blue character of the state. If you vote during a state Supreme Court election and the composition of the court is modified either blue or red, that could change it. Yes, not easy to do though, right? Because the state that is a trifecta, all red, all blue, to have a Supreme Court that's going to be the opposite color, not an easy matter. Yes, please.
You have a publication that explains all of this, because this is so clear and so important. I think more people need to see this.
Well, I'm going to talk to my friend Bill Hollahan, and we're going to determine how we can perhaps use this presentation in a way that could be distributed in a different kind of setting.
I think the Shepherd Express should be talking to you.
But,
I think the Shepherd Express should be talking to you.
you know, as I indicated, and I really appreciate your patience, when I get this kind of a lecture, I usually have a mic that I carry around with me so I can walk around. It's a lot easier than one where you have to be conscious of the mic in front of you and you have to be conscious of other things. So I think it could be done in a way with greater clarity as well, but I appreciate your thought. Yes, please.
Are you aware of the term landslide county?
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear.
Are you familiar with the term landslide county? This is where people have moved to different places so that a county would have, I think it's 20% difference between the Republican and the Democrat vote in that county. So it's really a landslide towards one side or the other. And so that's another reason that we have reds and blues, because people are moving the city or the country to be with people of the
Yes.
same political.
Yes, I think it's true.
Yes, there's a fact that since the 70s, I think we've had a great
Yes.
movement towards more of these landslide counties.
I wonder if you heard that. It talks about people who, as they become more familiar and feel more serious and have more serious feelings about their ideology and their beliefs, would follow that instinct and that need by moving into a state where they feel they might be better welcome.
Sort of like moving to the east side of Milwaukee.
That's right. The blue east side of Milwaukee. Well, I think maybe we may have exhausted our question.
Any other questions or comments other than? So. Here, but how to have you in our community. Yes, thank you so much for coming.